So welcome everybody to the Chess Kids webinar, school chess coaching session that we've got today. You can see on the screen a set of notes that we're going to be handing out to everybody by email after the presentation is over. And that shows us what we're going to be learning today, the electric fence checkmate. So this is one of the most useful strategies that you will ever learn for finishing a game off. So it's a technique that you use at the end of the game, particularly when you've got two rooks left. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off by having a look at a couple of situations where it is checkmate, and then we're going to try and work out how can we get to that position. All right, and we'll give you those notes at the end of the day. So to start off with, the position that you see on your screen now is checkmate. And to make sure that it's checkmate, there are three things you need to check. First of all, is the king in danger? And yes, the king's definitely in danger here. You can see the rook's putting the king into check. All right. Then we have to say, can you take the piece that's attacking you? So we have a look at the rook over here in the corner. We can't capture that piece. Can you put something in the way to block it off? Well, obviously there's nothing that can go on any of those squares between the rook and the king, so you can't block it off. And then can you run away? Can you move your king somewhere to any of those squares there? And anywhere that you move your king, would one of those moves get your king safe? Well, in this position, certainly not, because the rook that's on h8, which is highlighted red, covers the whole back row, and the rook that's here on g7 covers all of the squares that are in front of the king. And so there we have a classic electric fence checkmate position. All right, so you need to know this because it's all very well learning all your opening strategies and some of the things that we've talked about in previous weeks, but once you know all your good strategies, you can take all your opponent's pieces. You get to a situation where they've got just a king left and nothing else. If you can't actually finish them off and get a checkmate, you're going to end up with a draw, which is only worth a half a point in a tournament situation. So you need to make sure that you get yourself a checkmate. All right, we're going to have another look at a situation where it's checkmate again. So the position is now changed on the screen. You'll be able to see that you have black's king in checkmate again. Same electric fence strategy, just a different position. So we've got the rook on a4. I'll highlight that one red for you. Covering the A file, that's the row on the far left-hand side, and then we've got the rook on b3 covering the B file. So the king is now locked on the back row, cannot move anywhere, and there we have another electric fence checkmate. So that's what we're aiming for. What if we've played a really good game, we've done all our good opening strategies, you've taken all your opponent's pieces out, and you get them into a situation where they've got just their king left, nothing else, and you've still got your two rooks. And here's an example of a position that you might end up in. Black's king's in the middle of the board, which gives him the most opportunity to sort of run away, keeps his king safer in the middle of the board than it is in the corner when it's down to the endgame. And white's got two rooks left. Now remember, this is a strategy. So a strategy is something that you're aiming for yourself, and you're not really worried about what your opponent's up to. It's just something that you're aiming for. Now, this strategy, you can use this electric fence strategy even if you have a queen or a bishop or pawns or other pieces on the board as well. So what you want to try and do is understand the strategy of how the electric fence works, and then from that strategy, you can use it in any number of different situations. This electric fence strategy is the most common checkmate in school chess clubs and inter-school competitions. So it's a really important one to know. And the question here is, for white, you've got your two rooks, you've got your king, black's got just his king. What would your first move be to try and start this electric fence strategy? And you can think back to the two positions we saw before where the king was in checkmate, and I'll just flash them up on the screen for you again. That was the first one that we saw. King's on the back row, checkmate with the two rooks. The second one that we saw, the king was on the edge of the board, and you've got the two rooks flying down the side of the board to give checkmate. All right, so back to our game scenario. If we're in this position here, we want to try and get black into checkmate. we're going to have to push that king onto the edge of the board. Now, it doesn't matter which edge, it can be the top, the bottom, the left or the right, but we do need to get the king onto the edge of the board. So if you think you know what the first move might be, type that into your question or your chat panel and see if you can come up with some suggestions as to what your first move would be if you were white. All right, we've had a suggestion for putting the king into check. Now let's say that our first move, we move the rook and we put the king in check. Black's king is now free to choose where he wants to go. The king can choose to move down or up, whichever direction he wants, backwards or forwards. So the first move that we want to try and do is to try and set up that electric fence. Okay, so let's take that move back and let's try and find a different move that we can do, first of all, to set up an electric fence without putting your opponent's king in check. So you don't actually need to do a check. What you need to do first up is to put the king in an electric fence. So the move that we're going to play is rook to h4. Okay, that's going to be our first move. Now, why we go here is because the rook now covers this whole row in front of the king. Okay, the rook covers the whole row in front of the king. It's covering all of these squares is what the rook's attacking. So the king can't move onto any of those red squares. If he tries to move onto one of those squares, he's putting himself into check. All right, and that's why we call it an electric fence, because this rook is sending out an electric signal or electric zapping all the way along that line there. So white's king can never come anywhere, on that line, because if it does, it's going to get zapped by the rook. It's continually sending out that stream of electricity. So if the king can't move onto that row, where can he move? Well, he's got the rest of the board to go in. So he's got this entire area behind to move into. So we've got all of this space here. We just colour all that in. All over here is all safe. The king's got plenty of space to go. All right, we call it an electric fence because this is now like his paddock. So if this king was a sheep, he'd be locked in that paddock. He could eat any of the grass that's in that area there, but he couldn't cross the electric fence and get into your nice flower beds. So the king's locked in. So where's the king going to move? Well, let's just say, for example, he just moves one step to the side. Okay, he doesn't want to go towards the edge of the board. He just wants to stay in the middle. All right, what's the next move going to be? We've got our electric fence set up. All right, this rook's covering the entire line in front of the king, so there's our electric fence. But the king isn't going to go towards the edge of the board unless we force him to. All right, we want him to get his king all the way back to the edge of the board eventually. All right, but he's not going to do that unless we force him to. So what move can we do to force the king to go to the back of the board? Right, now I can see Anastasia's got her hand up there. So what I'd like you to do, Anastasia, is if you can type into the chat box, into the questions panel, what move you would like to do if you were white here to try and force the king further back. Because obviously you know what the answer is. We'll give you a moment to try and type that into the chat box. The hand flew up straight away, so that was great. See if you can type that into the chat box. We might try and get Shanti or someone to give you a bit of a hand with how to type those ones into the chat box and see if we can get you typing in your answers there, because you've got your hand up saying that you know the answer. All right, we've got from Matthew an answer. The rook is now going to move to b5. All right, so we've got the king in check, and we've still got the electric fence from this rook that was on h4, covering all of those squares there. So the king can't move down the board. He's in check. He's got to move up the board. All right, so we're starting to get the king going closer towards where we're aiming. We're trying to aim the king. We're trying to shepherd him onto the back row. So the king has no choice but to move backwards. All right, now as soon as the king steps backwards, we've now got the rook on b5, which is covering all the squares to the left and right. That's become the new electric fence. And the next move is to try and push the king further back. So again, we're going to move the rook down to h6. We've got the king in check. we've got the rook on b5 as the electric fence now. All right, so this one here is covering that whole line. The king can't stand that direction. King's in check, has to go backwards again. Okay, so let's say he chooses to go backwards. Next move, we've got our electric fence with this rook. We can move our rook from b5 down to b7 and put the king in check. Okay, so you can see that we're just slowly stepping the king backwards, one step at a time, one step at a time. I'll just take a step back from here for joy. So you've just asked the question in this position why the king isn't moving into c5, and that's what the rook on b5 is doing, that electric fence. This rook covers all of those squares to prevent the king from moving closer to us down the board, and we're forcing him with the check to go closer to the back row, which is where we want him to aim. Okay, so we've gone back a step. All right, so from here we're going to see what the king's next move is. Now we're going to move the king back to c7, which is a little bit trickier. There's only really one thing that black could possibly do to give you any trouble, all right? And that's to put his king close enough to take your rook. All right, so we've got this rook with our electric fence covering this whole line along the 7th row, but black's king has moved so close to us that he could just unplug that electric fence. He just reaches out, pulls the plug, and our rook's gone. So if we're not careful, if we just keep on going with our pattern and we do check, black's going to say thanks very much, unplug the electric fence, and you don't have your checkmate anymore. You don't have your electric fence checkmate anymore. So what we need to do is, let's go back here. When you see that the rook is in danger, we're saying, uh-oh, our rook's being attacked by the king, all we need to do is move that rook out of the way. That's the good thing about electricity. Electricity moves at the speed of light, 300,000 kilometers a second. All right? A king only moves one square at a time. That's much slower. So the rook moves out of the way, moves across to g7, and black's king has got no choice. Can't move forwards because we've got the rook still covering the whole 7th row with an electric fence. The king has no choice but to move left or right, stay on the back row, and we've got our final move, which is rook down to the back row, and there we've got our electric fence checkmate. Okay, so we've got our rook covering the back row, other rook covering the 7th rank, and you've got your electric fence checkmate. All right, so this is the same position that we saw at the start. Okay, we'll go back to the original position. This is exactly the same position that we saw at the start, where we've got the king onto the back row. We've got him in checkmate. Okay, so I'll just wait for people's screens to refresh so they can see that final position. All right, so that's how we try and force the king to the back row. We set up the line in front of the king and put him into an electric fence. Then we push him further back. Now there are a couple of things. Let's go back to the start and let's have a look at a few things that can go wrong when you're doing your electric fence. All right, so first move, we've got the electric fence and black moves. Okay, so one common mistake that people make here is they start putting the king into check, which is the right thing to do. All right, we've got the electric fence, we've got the rook covering the 4th row, so the king is now locked into his paddock on the back 4 rows. Okay, so he's locked into this area on the back 4 rows, and they think, well, the next move should be a check, which is correct. It should be a check. They move their rook to d1 and give a check. All right, so now we've got the rook giving a check this way, and we've got our electric fence coming that way. And I don't know if anyone remembers the old movie Ghostbusters, but one of the most important things for the Ghostbusters to remember was don't cross the beams. If you cross 2 electric wires, you can get an explosion. Things go wrong, all right, unless you know what you're doing. So here, we've got the electric fence, we've got this rook covering the 4th row, right? We've got the king locked in his paddock on the back of the board, but then we're trying to use the other rook to give a check in the opposite direction. All right, so you've got the rook on d1 attacking vertically, that's up and down the board, and you've got your rook on h4 attacking horizontally, that's across the board. And that's not going to work out, all right, because black just moves his king anywhere he wants. You can keep on check using the vertical attack, and he'll just go back to where he was before. There's no reason for black's king to head towards the edge of the board. All right? There's no reason for that king to head towards the back of the board because we're giving him a check on crossing the beams with the rook that's on h4. Okay, so we definitely don't want to cross the beams. All right, so that's the first thing. Make sure that you don't cross the beams. You're moving your rook down always in the same direction. So if you're going a horizontal electric fence here, we do a horizontal electric fence with the other rook. Okay, and slowly the king gets towards the edge of the board. The other problem that sometimes people fall for, the traps that people fall for, is that they move without thinking. Okay, if black moves his king here to c6, he's now attacking your rook. All right, now if he can just reach over and unplug your electric fence, you're not going to be able to do that strategy anymore. You're going to have to go for something else. So you've got to make sure that before you just reach out and grab your rook and start moving it, and then you think, uh-oh, touch move, you have to think about what your opponent's move was, and oh, yep, if your rook's in danger, you've got to try and get that rook safe. Now, if you do a touch move, you're lucky you could see it before you let go of it. You could change your mind and move your rook to just protect each other, and your rooks are protecting each other along the electric fence there, and you'll still be able to do that strategy. All right. Remember, you can do that electric fence strategy either way. Let's say at the very start of the game we want to do an electric fence and try and get the king to the edge of the board. You could do that sideways as well by moving on your first move, rook to d1, using an electric fence here. When the king moves, rook to e2, and now we've got a vertical electric fence that's going to push black's king towards the edge of the board on the right-hand side, and we still end up with a checkmate. All right, so that's electric fence strategy. What I'm going to suggest that all of you guys do after this lesson is practice this strategy. And the way to do that is you give black all the pieces that you see on the board. Okay, he gets king, two kings, well obviously one white, one black, and white gets two rooks. But black gets to choose where to put those. So black might say, all right, let's take my white's king and let's put white's king in the middle of the board. And then he'll say, all right, let's put black's king somewhere that's going to be safe. And we're going to put white's rook in a position of danger, and we're going to put white's other rook blocked off by his own king to make it a little bit tricky for white to get the electric fence checkmate. All right? And then you go from there and see what you would do, see if white can do an electric fence from that position. But give black the chance to put all those pieces on the board, and then white has to be the one to think, well, gee, what's my first move going to be to try and set up that electric fence on your very first move. All right, that's the electric fence strategy. That's pretty easy. You'll go and practice that. Now I want to go on to something that's a little bit more advanced, which is what happens when you've only got one rook. Okay, so let's say that you make a mistake, or maybe you've only got one rook. Maybe this is a much closer game than the ones that we've looked at before, and you're down to just one rook. Can you get a checkmate? All right. What do you think? What do people think? Do they think that it's possible to get a checkmate when you've got just one rook and a king against your opponent's king? Yep, most people are agreeing. Yes, it is definitely possible to get a checkmate. The rule is, or the tip that you can use to try and work out whether you can get a checkmate, you need to have at least 5 points worth of material in order to get a checkmate on your opponent. Okay, a rook is worth 5 points. That means you can do a checkmate. If you had only a knight, then you couldn't do a checkmate because a knight's only worth 3 points. So no matter how hard you try, all right, let's just clear this off. Let's put black's king in the corner of the board, white's king as close as possible, and no matter how hard you try, you can get the knight to put the king in check, but the king's always going to be able to move across one step. He's always going to be able to go somewhere safe. Or if you don't put the king in check, and we use the knight to cover those squares the king can move to, that's where we end up with a stalemate, where the king's completely safe, can't go anywhere at all. Okay, so that would be a stalemate. We'll do some lessons about a stalemate another time. But with just a knight, impossible to get a checkmate. Same thing if you use just a bishop. With just a bishop, you can put the king in check, and he'll always move out of the way, but you can't do a checkmate. Now the reason a knight or a bishop can't do a checkmate on your opponent's king just as individual pieces is because a bishop only covers one color. It only covers black squares. So you can cover the black squares, but the king will just run to the white square. Or if you cover the white squares, the king's going to be able to hide on the black square. Same thing with a knight. Wherever a knight is, it's only covering one colour. So if it's on a black square, it's covering the white squares. Of course, black's king just sits on the opposite colour and keeps himself safe. A rook, on the other hand, when a rook moves, when a rook attacks, it's covering both black and white squares. So a rook's going to be able to do a checkmate. All right, so you need at least 5 points. We've got the rook. Now how are we going to do the checkmate? Well, we do it exactly the same way. It's just that we've only got one rook, so we have to use our one rook as an electric fence. Now here, we've got this rook covering the E file. So we're just going to go with a checkmate from the E file. The king's locked off now on the F, G or H files, just those three rows down here. So the king's locked into that little area there by the electric fence that's covering the E file. And we're going to see how white's going to end up with a checkmate. All right, so let's say, sorry, first move white's turn here. White's going to move his king down. He's going to need to use his king as the other electric fence to try and help get a checkmate. So in chess, one piece is never enough to get a checkmate. You need to use all your pieces together. You need to have a team effort. So we're going to have the rook and the king working together. All right, black moves his king, and now white needs to get that, make sure that that rook is far away. So he's going to retreat his rook back a few steps to get out of the way. Black moves his king, and now we have the critical position here, where your king for white covers the squares that are in front of black's king. All right, those three squares there make like a mini electric fence. So black's king now can't step to the left anymore, and now is the time to drop your rook across one square, put the king into check, and use your king to cover any of the places that that black might try and move his king. All right. So black's in check. He can't move. He can't move his king anywhere to the left onto the E file. He can't move it anywhere on the F file because the rook's covering it. So he has no choice but to move the direction we want him to go, which is towards the edge of the board. Now we're going to make black a good player, and he's going to move his king, try and get towards your rook to attack your rook. Okay, so king now moves down here. Again, the same situation, and he's coming down towards your rook to try and attack the rook. Okay, so as soon as you see that your rook's attacked, let's get that rook out of the way. Okay, now we're going to move that rook as far as possible. Okay, the further you move the rook, the safer it's going to be. Now, if black's king tries marching down to attack your rook, as soon as you've got the king covering the squares to the left of black's king, can't move to the left anymore. Now's the time to move your rook one step to the right. We're putting the king in check. King still can't go to the left because we've got our king making a mini electric fence, and the king has to move towards the back of the board. All right, move the king in again, ready to do a checkmate next move. If you can, you're going to move your rook across and do a checkmate. But black's king just moves out of the way. So if you try and set up a checkmate, okay, here we go. Next move, we're going to do a checkmate by putting the rook into the corner. The king moves out of the way. You try and set it up ready to do a checkmate, king moves out of the way. All right, so we could go on like this forever. We could go backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards all day if we wanted to. All right, the thing to do is we need to wait. We need to wait so that it was black's turn to move, and then black would move his king in front of us, and then we'd be ready to do the checkmate. Okay, so if black could move the king there, now we'd have a checkmate. All right, but we go back to this position. It's white's turn to move, so we just want to waste a move. We actually just want to waste a move. We're going to move our rook just one step forwards. That doesn't really change anything. Our rook's still covering this whole row here. That's an electric fence. The king can't move off the back row. Now black thinks, well, hang on a second. If he moves his king here, we've got the kings facing each other again. Those squares are all covered, and white's got his checkmate. Check, and the squares are covered. There's the checkmate. So black says, well, no, I don't want to go in front of the king. I want to move the opposite direction. Okay, he runs away from your king, and you just follow him. Wherever the king runs, you're just following him, and eventually the king's going to run out of places to move. He can't go off the board this way. He's got to come back And now, here we go, we've got the king blocked off with those three, and we've got the rook onto the back row, and there's our checkmate. All right, rook's attacking the king, and all the squares that he's trying to move to are covered. All right, so we've got that no matter what black does. All right, so the tricky part about doing that checkmate is just to make sure that your kings are lined up properly. And just remember, if you get into this little loop where your kings are going backwards and forwards, and they're going backwards and forwards, just waste one move, just move your rook one step, and then the king's not going to be able to come towards your rook anymore. He's going to have to move away, and as he moves away, you start running down the board and chasing after him. All right, so that's a couple of checkmates that we've seen today. We're going to be sticking on the line here for a few more minutes to answer any questions that people have about checkmates in the endgame, about electric fence checkmate, that's with your two rooks, or the electric fence checkmate that we've seen with just the one rook and using your king as the second piece. So if you've got any questions, please feel free to stick around and ask them. If you don't have any questions, get out there and actually start practicing. So what I'd like you guys to do is set up a position like you see on the screen. Start off with the two rooks, try and get a checkmate. All right? If you can do it, a good goal, a good thing to aim for is to try and be able to do a checkmate with your two rooks against the king from any situation in 15 moves or less. If you can do it in 15, go for 10. All right, so once you've got that set up, see if you can challenge yourself and try and get that checkmate as quickly as possible, the smallest number of moves possible. See if you can get a checkmate in 10 moves with your two rooks. Once you've done that, if you can get the two rook electric fence checkmate every single time, move on and set it up with just the one rook. All right, give yourself a few more moves, go for 20 moves. See if you can do checkmate from any situation that black chooses in 20 moves from there. All right. We've had a couple of questions about other checkmates, so we're going to answer those questions, and then we're going to wrap things up for today. So we've had a question from Joy about bishops and being able to do a checkmate with bishops. Yes, you certainly can do a checkmate with two bishops, because a bishop plus a bishop is 6 points. You can do a checkmate. Of course, everyone knows there is an exception to every rule, and the exception to this rule is that you need anything with 6 points will work, except two knights. Okay, so if we've got two knights and your opponent's got just his king, while it's possible to get a checkmate, it's impossible to force a checkmate. All right, so if black's king helps you out and runs into the corner, right, then you can do a checkmate. But if he decides to move away from the corner at any point in time, then you can't do a checkmate with two knights. So two knights is probably worth like 4.9 instead of 5 points, because when they're on their own like that, they can't quite force the king into the corner and get him into a checkmate. But generally, 5 points is your minimum score. If anything more than 5 points, you can do a checkmate. So the question was, can't you win when you've got just a pawn? Well, again, let's say that both players have got a king each and one person's got a pawn. Yeah, of course you can win from here, but only if you can get that pawn to the end of the board. If you get the pawn to the end of the board, bingo, you turn into a queen. Now your queen is worth 9 points. And we will do a lesson with how to get a checkmate with a queen and a king against a king. That's called it's a royal waltz. A waltz is a kind of dance, and we can use the queen and the king to dance the king onto the edge of the board and deliver a checkmate. So we'll teach you that another time. For the meantime, if you want to try and do a checkmate with the king and the queen, you can use the same electric fence strategy that we've used with the rooks, because a queen moves very much the same way as a rook. Just watch out for a stalemate. All right, guys, thanks very much for being part of today's session. I will be around for a few more minutes anyway to answer some more questions, but we're going to stop this now, and the recording will be up online for people to view at a later date. Thanks very much.